What if the most famous misunderstanding in literary history is not that Don Quixote mistook windmills for giants, but that we mistook his entire mission for madness? Because the deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes. For more than 400 years, people have laughed at an old man in rusted armor chasing impossible dreams across a dusty landscape. They see a man disconnected from reality. A man fighting battles that do not exist. A man refusing to grow up. But here's the question almost nobody asks: what if Don Quixote was not running away from reality? What if he was running toward something the rest of the world had already abandoned? That possibility changes everything. Because Don Quixote appears at a very particular moment in history. Not merely when knights were disappearing, but when an entire way of seeing the world was beginning to die. The old stories were losing their power. The great ideals that once gave meaning to suffering, sacrifice, honor, and purpose were becoming relics. What had once felt sacred was becoming impractical. What had once inspired people was becoming something to mock. And standing in the middle of that transformation was a man wearing an outdated suit of armor. At first glance, he looks ridiculous. But look closer. Sometimes the most important figure in a civilization is not the person who adapts to the new world. Sometimes it is the person who refuses to let something valuable disappear without a fight. That is where the contradiction begins. People call Don Quixote irrational because he sees significance where others see ordinary objects. Yet modern life presents us with a different question. What happens when a society becomes so focused on facts, efficiency, and utility that it stops seeing significance anywhere at all? Which condition is more dangerous? To imagine meaning where none exists? Or to lose the ability to recognize meaning altogether? That question turns Don Quixote from a literary character into something much larger. He becomes a warning. A symbol. A memory fragment from a civilization standing at the edge of a profound transformation. Think about the image that survived for centuries, an aging knight charging toward a windmill. Everyone remembers the windmill. Almost nobody remembers what it represents. Because the windmill is not merely an object. It is a collision between two worlds. One world still believes life should be organized around ideals larger than the self. The other world believes reality is only what can be measured, proven, and used. And once you see that collision, another mystery emerges. Maybe Don Quixote's greatest fear was never failure. Maybe it was something far worse. Maybe he feared waking up one day in a world where nothing remained worth believing in. A world where every myth had been dismantled. Every symbol explained away. Every ideal reduced to a practical calculation. A world that was perfectly rational. And spiritually empty. The unsettling part is that this question no longer belongs to Don Quixote. It belongs to us. Because if meaning is not something a civilization can survive without, then the real mystery is not why Don Quixote fought so hard to preserve it. The real mystery is what happens after it disappears. If Don Quixote was trying to protect meaning, then we have to ask a more uncomfortable question. What exactly was he protecting it from? Most people assume meaning disappears because people stop believing in old stories. But history suggests something far more complicated. Meaning rarely dies from direct attack. More often, it fades when a civilization becomes so successful at solving practical problems that it forgets why those problems mattered in the first place. That is the paradox at the heart of Don Quixote. The world around him is not collapsing. It is becoming more organized. More rational. More efficient. In many ways, it is improving. Yet beneath that progress lies a subtle transformation. The language of purpose is slowly being replaced by the language of usefulness. And those are not the same thing. A tool can be useful. A life needs purpose. A system can be efficient. A civilization needs meaning. That distinction is easy to miss because meaning does not disappear all at once. It disappears symbol by symbol. A weathered suit of armor becomes scrap metal. An ancient ideal becomes a joke. A heroic story becomes entertainment. a sacred symbol becomes a curiosity. And eventually, people forget that these things once carried psychological weight far beyond their material value. This is where Don Quixote becomes fascinating. His role is not merely that of a dreamer. He functions almost like a living memory, a walking archive of values that the surrounding culture has begun to abandon. Every step he takes in that old armor becomes a refusal to let certain ideas vanish quietly into history. But here is the contradiction. The more he tries to preserve those values, the more absurd he appears. And that contradiction reveals something profound about human societies. The people who preserve meaning often look irrational to the people benefiting from a world that meaning helped build. Think about it. Many of the principles that shape civilizations, honor, duty, sacrifice, courage, faith, loyalty, cannot be measured with instruments. You cannot place them on a scale. You cannot calculate them like a business report. Yet remove them completely, and something essential begins to erode. The question is not whether these values are practical. The question is what happens when nothing exists above practicality. That is where another figure enters the story, not as a rival, but as a mirror. Sancho Panza represents the gravitational pull of ordinary reality. He sees the world as it is. Tangible. Immediate. Grounded. Yet the deeper their relationship develops, the more a strange exchange begins to occur. The realist is drawn toward imagination, while the idealist is constantly confronted by reality. Why? Because human beings seem to require both. Reality without meaning becomes sterile. Meaning without reality becomes dangerous. And somewhere between those two extremes lies the tension that has haunted every civilization. This is why the dusty road itself becomes a memory fragment. It is more than a road. It is a symbol of the space between what exists and what ought to exist. Between the world we inherit and the world we hope for. The old knight keeps moving forward through that dust because he is pursuing something larger than victory. Larger than success. Larger even than truth in the ordinary sense. He is searching for a reason to believe that existence can be more than survival. And that search leads us to a deeper mystery. Because if Don Quixote represents the defense of meaning, then we must confront a disturbing possibility. Perhaps civilizations do not enter crisis when they lose wealth, power, or security. Perhaps the real crisis begins when they can no longer answer a much simpler question: what is all of this for? But what if that question contains a hidden trap? Because once we begin talking about meaning, most people instinctively assume the goal is to defend old beliefs. To preserve traditions. To hold on to comforting stories from the past. Yet that is not the deepest conflict here. The deeper conflict emerges when we realize that meaning itself can become a source of danger. After all, history is filled with people who believed in something larger than themselves. Some built cathedrals. Some built civilizations. Some devoted their lives to causes, ideals, and visions of the future. But others created disasters. The same human capacity that allows us to sacrifice for noble purposes can also lead us into destructive illusions. And suddenly the problem becomes far more complicated. If a society loses meaning, it risks spiritual exhaustion. But if a society embraces meaning without restraint, it risks fanaticism. So where is the balance? This is the contradiction hiding beneath the surface. The old knight represents devotion to ideals. The rational world represents devotion to reality. Each appears to contain the cure for the other's weakness. Yet each also contains the seed of its own collapse. Reality alone cannot tell people what is worth pursuing. But ideals alone cannot tell people whether they are pursuing a fantasy. That tension has never disappeared. In fact, it may be one of the permanent conditions of human existence. And this is where the role of Don Quixote becomes increasingly unsettling. Because the more closely we examine him, the less he resembles a man trapped by delusion. Instead, he begins to resemble a test. A test directed at everyone around him. Notice what happens whenever an uncompromising ideal enters a practical world. The practical world immediately asks, is it useful? Does it work? Can it produce measurable results? Those questions are reasonable. But Don Quixote's existence introduces a different question. What if the most important things cannot be measured at all? Honor cannot be weighed. Meaning cannot be quantified. Wonder cannot be placed inside a spreadsheet. Yet entire civilizations have been shaped by such invisible forces. This creates a cognitive gap that becomes impossible to ignore. Modern societies often assume that progress naturally creates fulfillment. More wealth. More information. More comfort. More efficiency. But history repeatedly reveals a strange pattern. Material advancement solves many problems while simultaneously creating new forms of emptiness. The body becomes safer. The mind becomes richer. Yet the soul begins asking questions that technology cannot answer. And that is where the crisis escalates from an individual struggle into a civilizational one. The dusty road becomes larger than a road. It becomes a symbol of humanity itself. Every generation walks that road. Every generation inherits systems, institutions, and explanations about how the world works. But sooner or later another question emerges. Why does any of it matter? That question cannot be permanently eliminated. It only changes form. And perhaps that explains why Don Quixote continues to survive long after the world that produced him disappeared. Not because he solved the problem, but because he embodies it. He becomes a memory fragment carried across centuries, an aging figure in worn armor refusing to surrender a vision that everyone else has declared obsolete. At first, that image seems tragic. Then it becomes uncomfortable. Because the more we analyze the surrounding society, the more another possibility begins to emerge. What if the real danger was never the man clinging to impossible ideals? What if the greater danger was a culture becoming incapable of producing any ideals powerful enough to inspire sacrifice at all? That possibility transforms the entire conflict. The question is no longer whether Don Quixote sees reality correctly. The question becomes whether the people around him have lost access to something equally essential. And that leads us toward a revelation hidden beneath everything we have explored so far. Perhaps the conflict is not between truth and illusion. Perhaps it is between two competing definitions of reality itself. And if that is true, then the old knight may be fighting a battle that almost nobody around him even realizes exists. What if the battle we have been looking at is not taking place in the external world at all? What if the conflict exists inside the human mind, at the point where facts end and meaning begins? This is where a deeper revelation starts to emerge. The old knight is often treated as a symbol of imagination colliding with reality. But that interpretation may be too small. Because human beings do not experience reality as raw facts. We experience reality through stories, symbols, values, memories, and visions of the future. Remove those invisible layers, and the world remains physically intact, yet something essential disappears. A mountain remains a mountain. A road remains a road. A human life remains a sequence of days. But why any of it matters becomes increasingly difficult to answer. This is why the worn armor becomes more than armor. It becomes a memory fragment of a forgotten function. Its value was never in the metal itself. Its value was in what it represented. Courage. Duty. Sacrifice. The willingness to place something above comfort. Once that symbolic layer vanishes, the object survives, but the meaning dies. And that may be the hidden tragedy running beneath the entire work. The surrounding world believes it is becoming more enlightened because it is shedding old illusions. Yet there is a question almost nobody asks. What if some illusions were never valuable because they were factually correct? What if they were valuable because they organized human existence around higher purposes? That idea creates a profound cognitive gap. Modern thinking often assumes truth and meaning naturally travel together. Yet history suggests they can move in opposite directions. A society can become more accurate in its understanding of reality while simultaneously becoming less certain about why life matters. That is not merely a philosophical problem. It is a civilizational problem. Because when shared meaning weakens, institutions eventually struggle to justify themselves. Communities struggle to remain cohesive. Individuals struggle to explain sacrifice. Future generations inherit systems that function, but no longer understand the deeper reasons those systems were created. This is where the role of Don Quixote becomes clearer. He is not merely defending ideals. He is unconsciously exposing a hidden dependency. Human beings require more than information. They require orientation. They need a reason to move forward on the dusty road even when no immediate reward is visible. They need symbols that connect present suffering to future significance. Without that connection, existence becomes increasingly transactional. Efficient. Predictable. Manageable. Yet strangely empty. And here the scale shifts again. What appears to be a literary question becomes a question about entire civilizations. The greatest threat to a culture may not be external enemies, economic decline, or technological disruption. The greater threat may emerge when people stop believing that anything deserves devotion beyond personal advantage. When every value becomes negotiable. When every symbol becomes ironic. When every ideal becomes a target for cynicism. At that point, the crisis is no longer about truth. It is about orientation. The civilization still knows how to build. It no longer knows what it is building toward. And that leads us to a revelation that changes the shape of everything we have discussed. Perhaps the old knight was never trying to convince the world that his vision was literally real. Perhaps his deeper function was something far stranger. Perhaps he was acting as the last guardian of a disappearing bridge between reality and transcendence. And if that bridge collapses completely, the question is no longer whether people can understand the world. The question becomes whether they can still find a reason to care about it at all. If meaning is not simply a decoration added to life, but a fundamental human need, then we arrive at the deepest question hidden inside this entire work. What was the old knight actually protecting? The answer may be far more profound than ideals, traditions, or even imagination. What he was protecting was the human capacity to transform existence into significance. This is the core revelation. The conflict was never between fantasy and reality. It was between two radically different ways of inhabiting reality. Most people assume reality is something we merely observe. We gather facts. We collect information. We describe the world as accurately as possible. Yet human beings have never lived that way. Every civilization, every culture, every generation has wrapped reality inside stories that answer questions facts alone cannot answer. Why suffer? Why sacrifice? Why remain loyal when betrayal is easier? Why continue when the road ahead disappears into uncertainty? Facts can describe these experiences. They cannot justify them. And that is precisely where the old knight acquires his deepest significance. His role is not to reject reality. His role is to reveal a truth about the human condition. Human beings do not merely need reality to survive. They need meaning to endure reality. That distinction changes everything. Consider the memory fragment of the dusty road stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The road is not valuable because it leads somewhere certain. It becomes meaningful because the traveler believes the journey serves a purpose greater than immediate reward. Remove that belief, and the road becomes distance. Keep that belief, and the same road becomes destiny. The physical world remains unchanged. The experience of living within it changes completely. This is what many readers miss. The old armor, the impossible quests, the symbols carried through a changing world are not remnants of ignorance. They are reminders that human consciousness operates through meaning structures. We orient ourselves through narratives. We endure hardship through purpose. We organize our lives around visions of what ought to exist, not merely what already exists. And here the contradiction reaches its final form. The rational world surrounding the old knight believes it has liberated itself from illusion. Yet in the process, it risks forgetting that every functioning society depends upon shared fictions of some kind. Not falsehoods in the ordinary sense, but collective meanings. Justice, human dignity, liberty, responsibility. None of these can be held in your hand. Yet entire civilizations rise and fall according to whether people believe in them. Suddenly the old knight appears in a new light. He becomes a guardian of an invisible infrastructure. Not roads or buildings. Not governments or institutions. Something deeper. The symbolic architecture that allows human beings to see existence as more than biological survival. And that leads to the most unsettling consequence of all. The greatest threat facing a civilization may not be the presence of false beliefs. It may be the disappearance of meaningful beliefs altogether. Because when every ideal becomes negotiable, every symbol becomes disposable, and every purpose becomes temporary, people do not necessarily become freer. They may simply become lost. The image that remains is not the image of a man confronting an obstacle. It is the image of a solitary figure carrying a fading flame through an increasingly skeptical world. Whether that flame represents wisdom or illusion is still open to debate. But perhaps that is the wrong question. The more important question is this: if that flame finally goes out, what else disappears with it that cannot easily be rebuilt? The most important consequence of this story is not what happened to a single man. It is what happened to an idea. Once we understand that the central conflict revolves around humanity's relationship with meaning, a new question emerges. What remains after such a conflict has run its course? What survives when a civilization gradually replaces symbols with functions, ideals with incentives, and purpose with efficiency? The answer is more complicated than either victory or defeat. Because the legacy left behind is neither the triumph of imagination nor the triumph of rationality. It is the permanent awareness that human beings require both. That awareness may be the true inheritance. The old knight's influence extends far beyond his own world because he exposed a problem that every generation eventually encounters. Progress can improve living conditions. Knowledge can expand understanding. Institutions can create stability. Yet none of these automatically generate meaning. The consequence is subtle at first. Individuals begin to experience a strange form of abundance without fulfillment. They possess more choices yet struggle to choose. They gain more information yet feel less certain. They achieve goals only to discover that achievement itself cannot answer deeper questions about purpose. This is where the legacy expands beyond literature and enters psychology. The human mind appears designed not only to solve problems but to orient itself toward significance. Remove that orientation and something unexpected occurs. The external structure of life remains intact while the internal experience becomes fragmented. This is why the image of the solitary traveler on the dusty road continues to resonate centuries later. It functions as a memory fragment because it reflects a universal condition. Every person eventually reaches a point where practical success and existential meaning become separate questions. One asks how to live. The other asks why. The distinction matters more than it first appears. Entire societies can become extraordinarily effective at answering the first question while becoming increasingly uncertain about the second. And when that uncertainty spreads, its consequences extend beyond individual lives. Communities become harder to unite around shared purpose. Institutions struggle to inspire loyalty beyond self-interest. Public life becomes increasingly transactional. The language of sacrifice begins to sound foreign. Not because people become less intelligent, but because they become less connected to narratives larger than themselves. The scale shifts again. What seemed like a personal struggle transforms into a civilizational pattern. Throughout history, cultures have often collapsed long after their physical structures remained standing. Roads remained. Markets remained. Governments remained. Yet confidence in the deeper reasons for collective existence slowly eroded. This does not mean meaning can be manufactured on command. That may be the most important lesson of all. Meaning cannot simply be engineered like a machine or distributed like a product. It emerges from shared symbols, aspirations, commitments, and visions that people voluntarily choose to serve. And that realization gives the old armor a final significance. It is no longer merely a relic of the past. It becomes a reminder that every civilization inherits values it did not create and depends upon meanings it cannot fully explain. The greatest mystery is not why some people continue carrying those symbols forward. The greater mystery is whether a society notices their importance only after they have disappeared. Which brings us to an unresolved paradox. If human beings cannot thrive without meaning, yet every source of meaning eventually faces skepticism, criticism, and decline, then what happens next? Where does a civilization find new purpose after it has dismantled the old one? And more importantly, how can it recognize the difference between a necessary illusion and a truth it cannot afford to lose? There is a reason this story refuses to disappear. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. Technologies transform the structure of daily life. Entire worldviews emerge and vanish. Yet the image remains. A solitary figure in aging armor moving across a dusty road toward a horizon that nobody else can fully understand. Not because he represents the past, but because he represents something permanently human. Perhaps that is the final insight. The lasting value of this work is not that it provides an answer. It is that it preserves a question. Every generation inherits a world that appears complete. A world filled with explanations, systems, and assumptions about what matters. Yet sooner or later, people begin to sense a gap between understanding reality and knowing how to live within it. That gap cannot be closed by information alone. It cannot be solved by efficiency, productivity, or comfort. It belongs to a deeper dimension of human experience. The search for meaning is not a problem to be eliminated. It is part of what makes us human. This is why the most powerful memory fragments from this journey continue to resonate. The worn armor. The endless road. The windmill standing against the sky. The companion walking beside the dreamer. None of these endure because of their literal significance. They endure because they have become symbols of an inner struggle that never truly ends. The struggle between what is and what ought to be. Between acceptance and aspiration. Between the world we inhabit and the world we believe could exist. And perhaps that is why the old knight still speaks to modern audiences. Not because we share his circumstances, but because we share his condition. We also live surrounded by systems larger than ourselves. We also inherit values we did not create. We also face moments when practicality collides with purpose, when certainty collides with hope, and when reality seems unable to satisfy the deepest needs of the human spirit. The story endures because it quietly reminds us that a meaningful life is not built from facts alone. Human beings require direction. They require devotion. They require something that pulls them beyond immediate self-interest and connects them to a larger horizon. Yet the work never allows us to become comfortable with easy conclusions. It does not tell us to abandon reason. It does not tell us to surrender ourselves to fantasy. Instead, it leaves us standing in the tension between them. That tension may be unavoidable. It may even be necessary. Because the same capacity that allows us to imagine a better world is also the capacity that prevents us from becoming fully satisfied with the one we already have. And so the legacy of the old knight is neither victory nor defeat. His legacy is the refusal to stop asking whether life can mean more than survival. Whether human beings can live without symbols, ideals, and stories that transcend immediate utility. Whether a civilization can remain spiritually alive after it has explained away everything it once considered sacred. The road disappears into the distance. The armor grows older. The symbols change from one era to the next. Yet the question remains where it has always been, waiting at the edge of the horizon. Not whether the giants were real, but whether there is something so meaningful, so worthy of devotion, that even in an age of endless explanations, we would still choose to walk toward it. And if we can no longer answer that question, what exactly have we gained, and what might we have lost?